still awake. I too would like to begin with thanking the Gilads and Cedric and the Chsania, and I'm really honored and privileged to be here. So, the title of my paper today, Prophetic Politics from Phenomenology to Theology, ties into a central premise in my doctoral dissertation, which, as you just heard, is titled Prophetic Politics, Political Theology in Early 20th Century Jewish Thought, and the Question of the Legitimacy of the State, Landauer, Buber, A.D. Gordon. And I chose to take on this subject today. It's a little snippet from my premise in my project. And I chose this conference as an opportunity for me to focus on this point with a higher resolution and to try and explain to myself this premise a little bit better. So I'm utilizing all of you for hopefully also some feedback, and I hope it will be helpful for anyone here who's working on similar themes, and for those who aren't, hopefully some food for thought. So this will have 4 short stages. I will first lay out the general argument, then I'll give a little textual example that illustrates it, I think, quite nicely. Then I'll show how I think it fits into the current moment of crisis in Jewish thought, and then I'll bring it home with a conclusion or two. So my argument today is quite simple, as you have already understood from the title, and it can be phrased like this. Within the current revival of the discourse about the prophetic, which by and large aims to locate and denote instances of prophetic voice in modern culture, and more specifically in modern political thought, we usually find some type of phenomenological aspect of prophecy as the focal point of the discussion. We tend to speak of the prophetic in terms such as religious rhetoric, or the charismatic demeanor of the prophetic persona, or his asceticism, or the anti-institutional sentiment, or revolutionary power in the prophetic message, etc. To give a quick and recent example of this, in February 2020, the journal Political Theology, who Agata is on the an editorial member of it, dedicated a special issue to the subject of prophetic politics. In the introduction paper, editors Nitzan Leibovich and Daniel Widener wrote the following. Prophetic politics is the proclamation of a radical change expressed in religious language at a time of deep existential and political crisis. It serves as a better trope to examine the complexity of the historical, political, and rhetorical circumstances within the field recognized as political theology. The emphasis of prophetic politics on counter-institutional rhetoric and sentiment lets a new form of theorization to emerge. So we can already see the phenomenological aspects. The reason for employing this phenomenological approach, of course, is that it enables us to juxtapose modern prophecy with biblical prophecy, and to include within the prophetic various instances of radical political critique throughout different times and places. Leibovich and Widener say this explicitly in their introduction. From Jeremiah's symbolic breaking of the vessels to Muhammad's open critique of the elites in Mecca, from the prophetic tone adopted by Martin Buber and Abraham Joshua Heschel in their struggle against nationalism and nihilism during the 1920s, to Malcolm X's and James Baldwin's critique of racism and imperialism in the 1960s. The historical trajectory of prophetic politics shows the prophetic word to be a rhetorical form that crosses boundaries of time and space, hierarchies, and identity. Clearly, the phenomenological approach enables this juxtaposition and is therefore a very valuable critical tool. And I want to stress this point. This tool is by no means unimportant. On the contrary, it's crucial and functional, and it is essential, and it is an essential part of the aesthetics of prophecy. And when I speak about aesthetics, I mean the poetics of prophecy, the drama of prophecy, in the deep sense of drama. And personally, for me, being a big fan of the biblical prophets and of prophetic literature, I absolutely love these aspects of prophecy, and I find them deeply connected to the human search for meaning and purpose especially in times of crisis. It's not surprising that in recent years there's been a return to the prophetic, precisely because of this sense of crisis within the liberal democratic world. And to return to a theme that has been raised here in the past 2 days, this liberal world, honestly, I think, has never not been in a constant state of crisis. So I don't know if this is like what Aaron said about 2,000 years, but at least 300-400 years, I would sign on that. Since its very inception in Western thought, liberalism is in crisis, because the very practice of liberalism ensues the political theological predicament, to use Strauss's term, which Shaul spoke about yesterday, emanating a constant mode of crisis. To put in different words, it's not that liberalism is in crisis, it's that liberalism is the crisis. It's the face of the crisis. And this isn't because it's a bad thing, but because, I think, it hasn't always paid its due to the theological aspects of its own validation. So this isn't a value judgment on liberalism, it's a structural observation, and I will elaborate on this point shortly. So returning to the phenomenological aspects, as much as they are important, they are not without problems. And there are quite a few problems, but I'll mention two immediate ones. One, these phenomenological traits don't really distinguish the prophet from the demagogue, against whom the critique is many times originally aimed. So we can think of, I don't know, Stalin's, Hitler's, they had charisma, right? They had anti-institutional sentiment. So phenomenology doesn't always help us differentiate between the demagogue and the prophet. The second problem is that the prophetic is not clearly differentiated with these traits from other agencies of political critique, such as the Messianic, the revolutionary activist, and the like. It should be said, and I treated this in my MA thesis, that it does help us differentiate the prophet from other mediator agencies, like the shaman or the priest or or divination, etc. But that's not what I'm talking about today. So my argument today, therefore, is that we should consider shifting the focus of discussion about the prophetic from the phenomenological aspects of prophecy to the theological aspects, which are sometimes harder to trace, but when we do trace them, we gain a much better understanding of the stuff which renders these voices prophetic, and differentiates them from within the larger family of titles that I just mentioned. In this family of terms, which we often use freely and not always mindedly, each of the terms implies, and I'm talking about the revolutionary, the activist, each of the terms implies a sense of crisis and urgency. And this crisis and urgency, depending on how they are interpreted, gives rise to various types of political actors or agencies. So the interpretation of how we need to approach the crisis, the urgency, the interpretation of the urgency, that's what emanates the different type of actor, the different type of agency. So the activist, or the literary critic, or the artist, or the monk, or the prophet, they all derive from how each of these interpret the urgency of the crisis. What I would like to argue is that the prophet, within this wider family of crisis-sensitive agents, the prophet is the one who understands this crisis as a political, theological crisis, as a state of events where the theological and the political are conflicted, or at the very least, not synchronized, in a way that neither makes sense, and hence emanating the crisis. Prophetic politics, according to this view, shouldn't only be defined as the one using radical religious rhetoric or speaking charismatically due to deep concern for justice and morality. Rather, it is the type of politics who is attuned to the theopolitical predicament and approaches the predicament, so it's not only attuned to it, but it approaches it by means of reconfiguring the theology, so that the very political as such can be thought and approached to begin with. If I mold what I just said into a neat definition, we can say the following. The prophet, ancient or modern, functions as the one who is attentive to the political theological crisis and then proceeds to solve it by means of reconfiguring the theological in a way that renders the political approachable, just, and therefore legitimate. If we take this one step further, we see that when used this way, prophetic politics is a certain type of political theology, we already said that, and if political theology is a discourse which presupposes that we can't think about the political or even address it without bearing in mind the preceding theological context, which transcends the political and bestows it its meaning, prophetic politics is a type of political theology in which the preceding theological structures are reconfigured. This diagram, which clearly attests to my graphic skills, shows the principle visually. Whether the political is an organization, like a republic, or a kingdom, or a commune, or a tribal federation, whether it's a political ideology, or simply even a political theory, none of these can be understood from the perspective of political theology without a preceding theological or metaphysical framework, which validates the political, bestows it its meaning, and legitimizes the very approach towards it. And usually there will be a correlation between the theology and the political constructs. We can draw a metaphor from the linguistics field, according to which we could say that theology is the semantics of the political, or, better yet, within the grammar of the political, wait, I lost my that. I just lost my place on the page.
The grammar of the political. Grammar of the political.
Name? Oh, here it is. Within the grammar of political theology, employing the political is implying the theological, and I actually really like this. I think it could be a good bumper sticker. So, if in this graphic model we see what an ideal political theological situation looks like, how would we graphically visualize a political theological crisis? Or in Strauss's words, a political theological predicament. Once again, I've relied on my astonishing graphic skills, and you can enjoy them with this next example. As we all see, it's actually quite simple. A political theological crisis is when the correlation between the two is completely lost. When standing within the polity, the theological structures don't make any sense, and therefore they are deemed unrelevant, unupdated, or dead. And when standing within the theology, the political structures don't make any sense, and are therefore deemed idolatrous. This is the predicament. It's a political theological eclipse, and this is also Strauss's symbolism of the horizons and eclipse. This pertains to what I said before. It's not that liberalism is now in a state of crisis, but rather that this is what liberalism has emanated. This is the state of crisis which liberalism is. It has created new political structures, but in a secularized framework, which leaves the theological unrelevant, or at the very least separated and eclipsed. And we as scholars, we can trace the theological roots, or the theological parallels, but it isn't necessarily something the founders or agents of liberalist humanistic modern political thought were attuned to, nor have their successors been attuned to ever since. Until this very day, we can see the ignorance towards this very basic situation. So we have the first two parts of this graphic trilogy. Let us move on to the third and final part. This is what prophetic politics does. Aha. It reconfigures the theology in a way that deems the political possible and thinkable. So it sort of like heals, or it's a remedy to the eclipse. It enables to approach the very thought and practice of politics in the polity, and furthermore, the thought and practice of the very possibility of the political as such. It makes the political legitimate again. According to the prophet, the political as such is not even legitimate without a grounded theological validation. If we said this in religious terms, we could say it like this. The prophet introduces new names, new books, new revelations, by which God can be called upon, and by which the society can orient itself in a way that can lead to political and spiritual liberation, which is much in need. The outcome of this process, at least in theory, is a new theology and a new society, which are correlated also one to another, but also to the reality of the given historical moment. The prophet, hence, is always perceived as an extreme threat to the existing political and religious institutions who rely on former dogma in order to repudiate him. When we approach the defining feature of the prophetic as a theological reconfiguration, bringing down new laws and new names, introducing a new theological grammar in order to enable a new politics, it's important to stress that the focus of the prophetic moves from employing a certain kind of political religious rhetoric, as in the phenomenological approach, to employing the very possibility of political speech as such. So this is a very important point. So now that we've laid down the argument, let's move on to the second part and enjoy a nice little biblical example of this. This structural understanding of prophetic politics is very interestingly illustrated in Menachem Lobelboim's reading of the biblical account of Moses standing in front of the burning bush and his following encounter with Pharaoh. In these encounters, Moses, for the first time, receives the revelation of two entirely new names of God. The first is Heye, which is unique only to this biblical scene. And the second is the Shema Meforash, Yud Hei Vav Hei, on which God explicitly says that he has never revealed this name to the ancestral fathers. I'm reading from Exodus Shmot Gimel, so I'll read the English, but the Hebrew is also there. Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come to the children of Israel, and I shall say unto them, The God of your fathers has sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am, Hayeh Asher Yeh. He said, Thou shalt say unto the children of Israel, I am had sent me unto you. Hayeh Shlachani Elechem. And then a few chapters later, after he goes to Pharaoh, he's revealed with another name. And God spoke unto Moses and said unto him, I am the Lord, Ani Hashem, Ani Adonai, Yud Hei Vav Hei, and I appeared unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob as God Almighty, Ke'el Shaddai. Ushmi Adonai lo nodati lehem. But by the name Yud Hei Vav Hei, I made me not known to them. According to Lobelboim, when God reveals his name to Moses and reveals a new name by which he was not known by to the ancestral fathers, he is actually revealing a new theological structure, which is fitting for the new political reality. In this case, the reality of the slave-based imperial polity of Egypt, to which Yud Hei Vav Hei is the theological answer. We can use the graph to explain this if we go back. So, in this first situation, we had El Shaddai and a family of a tribal family of shepherds. And then we have the Egypt and slavery, and this is the predicament, to which the answer is Yud Hei Vav Hei and the Torah and the covenant. So this is a new political, and this happens in cycles. This is how theology advances. Enter Moses, who reveals new structures and gives the political reality new theological trajectory. This is the political theological structure of the prophetic. So let us now fast forward to the current crisis of Western liberalism and see how prophetic politics plays out in this moment, according to this approach nowadays. So, starting with Spinoza in the 17th century, this theological political crisis, or predicament, or eclipse, began, and it culminated, most famously articulated in Nietzsche's profession about the death of God. Gott ist tot, in the end of the 19th century, so about a little over 200 years later, in the Gay Science in 1882, from which Chagi read yesterday, and of course also in Das Spoke Zarathustra in 1887. Now, Heidegger also has about Nietzsche saying the death of God, and although it has been popularized in modern secular culture, Nietzsche's statement as an anti-theological statement signifying the end of religion, and this is building on Heidegger. Nietzsche's profession is actually a very theological statement, signifying the reality of crisis, meaning that the structures by which Western culture had perceived and understood the divine, as well as its relationship with the world and the humanity, these structures have collapsed. new alternative theological models were called for, revelations of new names with which God and man could be called upon or in need. In fact, Nietzsche's Übermensch is in itself an alternative model of the like. One could easily argue that proclaiming God's death is in fact another way of ushering in a theology of individualism, in a cosmology driven by the will to power, and all this is inclined towards an eschatology of the superhuman. Contrary to individualism, on the other side of the spectrum, was the theology of nationalism, which received its finest articulation in the work of Carl Schmitt. The very term political theology, of course, was retrieved in 1924 by the soon-to-become Nazi Schmitt, who famously argued in his treatise Political Theology that all the political structures of modernity are secularized theological ones. Schmitt wasn't only alluding to an interesting fact of intellectual history, which is, in fact, a very interesting fact of intellectual history. He was actually setting the ground. He was setting the ground for a new understanding of the political, one which would affirm the deification of the nation-state as the new Godhead. A thesis which appeared in more elaborated form in his 1927 article, The Concept of the Political, and furthermore in its 1932 and 33 revisions, which were revised according to the hidden dialogue he had with Strauss. Schmitt proposes to solve the theological eclipse by identifying the lost theology with the political itself. So I didn't do a diagram of this, but just remaining only with the political as the ultimate. For him, the political is the ultimate ontology. The political is the new theological. One could make the case that the Third Reich, of which Schmitt gladly became crown jurist, was in fact an attempt to have Western theology consumed entirely by power politics. Between individualism on one side and nationalism on the other side, many Jewish thinkers in the Weimar Republic were struggling with this very predicament of the death of the theological structures and the need for new ones, and turned to gather them in heterodoxical sources and traditions. So in my doctoral dissertation, I'm focusing on three Jewish thinkers whom I believe were central in recognizing this problem and addressing it. Gustav Landauer, Martin Buber, and Aleph Dalet Gordon, who, of course, was not from Weimar, but belongs to this type of prophetic politics. All three of them were concerned with a theological void, but they were reluctant to fill it with secular ideologies, be it individualism or nationalism. And although socialists, they were just as well opposed to Marxist communism due to its dogmatic materialism, scientific historicism, and its adoption of the idea of state. In other words, they perceived the three major runners, liberalism, fascism, and communism, as inadequate and unequipped for meeting the call of history, for remedying the political theological crisis, for de-eclipsing the eclipse. In their eyes, these were merely conservative reproductions of the same old political structures and theological structures. Identifying the individual or the state with God was no new revelation. On the contrary, it was a form of idolatry. And merely replacing national politics with economic class struggle was insignificant. The key for them was to focus on community, situating them in the tradition of anarchism, but in a specific manner that was a derivative of their keen interest in mysticism. And later on, in his 1945 essay, Netivot Utopia, Buber will call this utopian socialism. Every one of these thinkers created new theological tools by the sole virtue of which, as far as they were concerned, it was even possible to approach the political. They all radically criticized the nation-state by virtue of a religious obedience to a higher theological authority they deemed transcendent, and I mean transcendent in the logical sense, to the state and to the very political as such. What differentiates them, and is therefore very interesting in my opinion, is that they all turn to different theological discourses in order to gather from there their new structures, thus each displaying a unique and different model of prophetic politics, both in terms of its critique, as well as the appropriate political future it envisions. What we have here, then, are three different models of prophetic politics which situate the question of the legitimacy of the state, or of the legitimacy of politics as such, in different theological discourses, Lander goes to Christian mysticism, and specifically Meistereichheit. Buber goes to biblical mythos and Hasidism, and Gordon to natural theology or eco-theology, and also Kabbalah and Hasidut as well. While all sharing the principle according to which the theological is transcendent to the political, preceding it, and therefore defining its conditions, its possibilities, its boundaries, and its entire legitimate validity. Without this logical contingency, they all deemed, the political enslaves the human being and the society, and the possibility of constituting a just and free society. And terminates the possibility of constituting a just and free society. To conclude, shifting the focus in prophetic politics from phenomenology to theology may seem nuanced, but I believe it is very important and sets, to my personal understanding, an alternative trajectory for political discourse and critique. Within the discourse of political theology and prophetic politics, as I mentioned, first, it helps us differentiate the seemingly identical traits of prophetic politics from populist politics. It helps us differentiate the prophet from the demagogue, or if you like, the true prophet who is motivated by the concern for justice, from the false prophet who is motivated by the concern for personal status or power. Secondly, it helps us differentiate prophetic politics as a form of critique from other forms of political critique, such as the revolutionary, activist, literary critic, etc. Or other forms of speech acts, such as the sermon, or the prayer, or the protest. Gilad, who spoke about this a few weeks ago. Another conclusion is within the wider public debate, prophetic politics perceived this way opens up, I hope, new understandings of the current crisis, and new understandings of the direction we might look to for possible remedies. It challenges both right-wing religious nationalism, as well as left-wing secular political theory, which tend to focus on the institutional separation of church and state. And this is an outrageous misunderstanding of the very meaning of church and state in Judaism. Prophetic politics reminds us that at least within a Jewish political critique, church and state may be separated on the institutional level, and this would be in correlation with the Augustinian theology of the two cities. But they cannot, and will not, and must not be separated on the theological level. Thank you.
Thank you, Yotam, for that fascinating talk, and thank you for being so comfortable. 23 minutes. Sorry, 33. 29. Okay, I got it. I'm really bad at maths. 29. Our second speaker is Or Shar, who is, did I say that right? Yeah. Who is faculty at the Cultural Studies MA program and research fellow at the Bucharest Institute for Research on Contemporary German History and Society at the University of Haifa. He is author of Thinking in